Thanks. I'll use this one, it's okay. Can we just make sure that the sound is right up on the input as much as possible on the master there? No, that's on this one. Right, sorry. Golly, you know, we had a bit of a problem. Good job we checked this at lunchtime because my laptop didn't work with the projector and then we couldn't get the sound. I mean, son of a gun, if I was a conspiracy theorist. Really. Well, I think, you know, what we've heard during the course today is really two categories of people being discussed, both of whom are conspiracy theorists, i.e. those that basically buy into the official version of events without doing any further research for themselves, and those who don't without doing any further research for themselves. And I would certainly absolutely acknowledge that there are a lot of people who I don't think really deserve, and they probably wouldn't even ask for the term researcher to be applied to them, because they're not, they're commentators. And there's a hell of a difference. And I certainly would agree with Jamie, you know, when he said that what we have to encourage is epistemological curiosity. You know, we have to encourage people to apply discretion and discernment and critical thought. Because, you know, let's acknowledge one thing. The role of the mainstream media is to control the narrative. To control the narrative. Fundamentally, the role of the mainstream media is primarily to tell people what to think and to save them from the time and trouble of going and doing some research for themselves. The role of the alternative community, on the other hand, is very, very different. And I certainly would be appalled if anybody took anything that I said at face value, because that is not the purpose of what I do. The purpose of, you know, really what I do is to try and encourage people to go and do some research for themselves, because I work on the basis that the truth cannot be told. The truth actually has to be realized, and it's for each individual to come to their own realization or conclusion as to what they believe the truth to be. So I represent, I hope, a third element which I don't think has really been discussed today. And, you know, one of the comments, I mean, I could spend some time going through some of the comments that have been made today, but the one that I'm going to pick up on was Karen Douglas, who said right at the start of her speech, she said, "My concern is not for the truth." Which really, for me, calls into the question, really, the value of the research. Because primarily, the important thing before you start to determine what labels you're going to apply to people is to surely establish for yourself where the truth lies. Because, you know, basically the government version of events, as I'm not going to spend too much time regaling the various aspects, but I'll probably throw in a couple of examples. But generally the government version of events is also a conspiracy theory. And quite often the physical evidence doesn't actually support the official version of events. I mean, with 9/11, for example, you actually have to suspend your knowledge of Newtonian physics to believe the official version of events. But what I'm going to do is just share with you some individuals that are part of this third category, i.e. these are credible researchers. And they are, by definition, generally full-time at what they do. And one of the reasons that other people perhaps do latch on to some of the things that we might say is because other people don't have the time, even if they have the inclination, to do the level of research that we do. And our research is primarily from primary source, and it covers the spectrum. And you know, included in my library is even this document here called The Power of Unreason, written by some guy called Jamie Bartlett. You know, it's important that we actually look at every aspect. And I can assure you that I could tell you and run through and make it very convincing. I could run through the official conspiracy theory of 9/11 and 7/7 probably better than any of the speakers that have been up here today. Because I know the official versions of events inside out, upside down and backwards. But then I look at the evidence. And like I said, I draw my conclusions, but I don't foist my conclusions on any other individual at all. I simply want them to take a look at for themselves. Let me start with this. This has appeared in The Sun earlier this week in response to a conference that took place in Swindon last weekend. It was on page 28. And I think, you know, I have to acknowledge that I think it's Nick Pope who actually gets The Sun to come along to these events. But what's very interesting is that The Sun has started to present these events in a slightly different light. And this might be because the government has pissed Rupert Murdoch off big time. So these articles that are written in response to supposed conspiracy events are no longer the demonization and marginalization of the attendees that they once were. Here was the headline: "We'll be flying at 35,000 feet and controlling your mind with chemtrails in our vapor trail." Well, I don't know about controlling the mind, but we got a pretty good grid of chemtrails going over London this morning, I noticed. But Nick, of course, you know, in return for getting the journalists to come along to the event, Nick gets his 2 penn'orth put in there. You know, almost every major event, world event, and anything paranormal is linked to a government cover-up, according to the conspiracy theorists. But I have to say, Nick, I've got to pick you up on this, mate. Conspiracy theorists reject anything that doesn't support their argument. I've spoken to several people who think 9/11 involved the US government, yet refuse to read the official report. It's intellectual laziness. So does that same observation apply to those who then question whether or not there is any validity to the alternative view about 9/11? Because it is fundamental that this document be read, and the supporting documentation with all the various interviews, and some of which didn't actually make it into the 9/11 Commission report. Intellectual laziness. I guess it was probably just lack of space, because I'm sure Nick would want absolute intellectual honesty, and so he probably added a sentence, but there just wasn't enough space for it. But in the recent months and years, 60% of the participants of the 9/11 Commission report have distanced themselves from it because they claim that they were set up to fail and they were not provided with accurate information. In fact, one of the members of the Commission, Jamie Gorelick, was actually tasked with filtering the information that went through to the 9/11 Commission team. And of course, it does not make a single mention about Building 7. So, quick straw poll, it's been referenced a couple of times. How many people think that this was an unfortunate car accident? Okay. And how many people just disregard this piece of information as completely erroneous? This is the note supposedly written by Diana that said, "This particular phase in my life is particularly dangerous, is most dangerous," and redacted, somebody, guess who, is planning an accident in my car, brake failure, da-da-da. Pure coincidence. Maybe they took her lead. How many people think this guy committed suicide in the woods? Lesser number. My good friend, Dr. David Halpin, and 4 of his medical colleagues have devoted the rest of their lives to opening a proper inquest in this. They have looked at every piece of information in the public domain, and they don't make any conclusion as to what occurred yet, other than to make the observation that according to all of the information that's in the public domain, there's no way this guy could have committed suicide. Jamie makes the observation, he says, "There are still millions of people who believe, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that 9/11 was an inside job committed by the US government to justify imperialist expansion." But Jamie, by his own admission, hasn't looked at all the evidence. So, you know, there is a lot of supposition here. Because, you know, when I have presented this evidence, and I've been doing so on an increasing basis, actually, because I think it's Jamie who makes the observation that, you know, 9/11, the 9/11 truth movement is a spent force. Sorry, mate. It's gaining momentum. More and more people are starting to realize that something doesn't add up between the official version of events and the physical evidence that's in the public domain. And this is from Karen's, I think this is her publication. "We found that individuals were more likely to endorse conspiracy theories if they thought they would be willing personally to participate in the alleged conspiracies." So in other words, if I had followed a slightly different path in life and had ended up as in the role of Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney, I would have been prepared to push the buttons that they've been pushing. Really, I mean, this for me is very, very shallow research. Does it take one to know one? I mean, Dr. Jacob Ruchti, writing in 1917, when he was doing an analysis of the real reasons behind the start of the First World War, made this observation. He said, "History cannot be permanently falsified. The myth cannot stand up to the scrutiny of scientific research. The sinister web will be brought into the light and torn to pieces, however artfully it has been spun." And there's no question, I mean, although this observation is 94 years old, there's no question that the last 20 years has facilitated greater ease of access to information. And so once upon a time, when academics were writing books such as, where am I? Here we go, Carroll Quigley's The Anglo-American Establishment. I'm sure that if Karen Douglas or maybe Jamie read this, they would say, "Oh my God, this is a rampant conspiracy theorist. This is a guy making academic observation, comment, Bill Clinton's mentor." People are familiar with Tragedy and Hope, but this is the real one, The Anglo-American Establishment. In Deep Geopolitics, we look not at events as random events, we look at the connectivity. And I certainly don't have the time this afternoon to really share all the links that maybe we look at to sort of build a case, if you like. That's more than an evening's presentation. But just going to introduce you to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's been a major player for 40-odd years, 50-odd years now. And Brzezinski is the Democrat version of Henry Kissinger, except that in the 90s, Clinton didn't really get on with Brzezinski, so he sent him back into academia. Well, Brzezinski wrote a book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, in which he was making the observation that 8 years after the fall of the Soviet state, the US really wasn't doing enough to establish itself as what he calls the superpower, i.e. to establish global dominance. But he also makes the observation that the American public actually are not likely to support a hegemonic foreign policy unless they actually feel threatened. So in the opening chapters, he says the public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And it's pretty much acknowledged many research circles in the US that Pearl Harbor was a contrived event. I have all the correspondence from Admiral Husband Kimmel, who certainly believes that he was set up and made the fall guy for the events of Pearl Harbor. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name because he believes information was deliberately withheld, thereby baiting the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor and thereby giving FDR the opportunity to take America into the Second World War. Later on in the book, where he's waxing lyrical about how the US really needs to get aggressive, it really needs to up its game and get into the role of global leadership. And he says, moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Well, there's a group of neoconservatives who effectively took a lot of what Brzezinski had written in the Grand Chessboard, and they produced this document called Rebuilding America's Defenses: Strategy, Forces and Resources for a New Century. And in this document, which effectively, as I say, plagiarizes actually, or builds on a lot of Brzezinski's observation, in this document, it is effectively the neocon blueprint for everything that's occurred to date. And if you want to know what's going to happen next, just download this document. But in this document, on page 51, it says, further the process of transformation, i.e. America actually stepping up to the plate and establishing its rightful place as the dominant force on the planet. It says, further the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. That document was released in September of 2000. There are 27 individuals that put their names to this document. 10 of those individuals went straight into George Bush's government when he was sworn in on the White House lawn in January of 2001. Here's some of those individuals. I'm sure you're going to recognize some of them. Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, John Negroponte. This is Scooter Lewis Libby. This is the guy who exposed Valerie Plame, the wife of Joe Wilson. He exposed the wife of Valerie Plame as a CIA agent because Joe Wilson refused to allow Cheney to state that Niger was providing yellow cake to Iraq. Joe Wilson knew that industry, he knew that area of the world. He went and investigated it for himself. He said there's no way Niger were providing the yellow cake. And when Colin Powell actually read out that statement prior to the invasion, Colin Powell was actually caught by a journalist when he was handed the text which said that Niger had been providing the yellow cake. Colin Powell basically said, "I'm not reading this shit." But he did. He did. He was told what to do. And then this guy, Dov Zakheim, he was the comptroller. He reported directly into Donald Rumsfeld. And on September the 10th, 2001, he made an announcement to the US media, and he said that the Pentagon cannot account for $2.3 trillion. Well, back then, that was a lot of money. You can also do a lot of black ops with 2.3 trillion. Now, normally, if you want to bury bad news, you put it out on a Friday. Because by the time the press teams come in on the Sunday night, so much else has happened that they've already forgotten the stuff that was put out on the wire on a Friday evening. But this went out on a Monday. So how could they have ever known that the following day, something of such significance would occur that completely wiped it from the media? And of course, on September the 11th, 2001, the US did indeed get its new Pearl Harbor, and reportedly, that's exactly what George W. Bush wrote in his diary that night. Today, we got our new Pearl Harbor. For those of us that do this kind of research on a full-time basis, it's not the case that we've always been into the deep geopolitical arena. There are normally events in our lives that trigger this. I don't have the time to go into the detail, but I spent 20 years in the oil industry, and I was one of the first civilians to go into Kuwait at the end of the first Gulf War in 1991. At the age of 34, what I witnessed in Kuwait rocked my world. For the first time in my life, I had cause to question the official version of events. I don't have time to go into the detail right now, but I didn't exactly rush out and announce what I'd seen, what I'd witnessed. And in fact, it took me 5 years to integrate the experience, but it started the process of research. By 1998, I'd really decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my working life in the oil industry. So I left the oil industry in 1998 and continued with my re-education process. When 9/11 went down, whilst I certainly didn't predict 9/11 exactly, although others did, I knew something of great significance was being planned. The evidence was simply this. From the time of being sworn in on the White House lawn, George W. Bush was invisible. He spent most of his time in either Crawford on his ranch or playing golf. He actually spent, I think, a total of 19 days in Washington in the period between January of 2001 and the events of 9/11. And it was pretty evident to me that, the guy had no record as an international statesman, and they were looking for an event, waiting for an event to kick off, to launch him onto that world stage. So that was my trigger way back in 1991. But by coincidence, the last time I was treading these boards here in the Conway Hall was 5 years ago when I was emceeing an event with this guy, Dr. David Ray Griffin. Up until 2003, Dr. David Ray Griffin was professor of theology and religious philosophy at Claremont College in California. And he was on his way home one evening and he saw some of his students, although he changed the story later to members of staff. Maybe members of staff gave it more credence, but I got the original draft and it says students. And as he passed the students, he saw that they were looking at websites which questioned the official version of 9/11. And he walked over and he said, "Come on, lads, don't waste your time. You've got theses that need to be prepared. Get off the computers now. This is just conspiracy stuff. Get off there and get on with the real work." And they said, no, Professor, you've got to take a look at this. You've got to take a look at this. And he said, no. And they said, "Look, Professor, everything you've taught us in terms of epistemological curiosity is coming into play here. You know, we're not necessarily saying it's right, but we've just come across this and, you know, we're investigating it. You need to take a look at this. Anyway, according to his own account, he said, all right, send me some links, and when I get home, I'll take a look. When he got home and had some dinner, and then he sat down at his computer, and he opened the email with the links, and that was about 9 o'clock at night. At 6:30 the following morning, he decided he better go to bed. He couldn't get off of it. And it had opened Pandora's box, and by David Ray Griffin's own admission, for the first time in his life, he had had cause to question the veracity of the government account of events. He was coming up to retirement. He decided that he would take early retirement and that he would focus on doing the research. And he's a prolific author. In his academic career, he wrote, I think, close on 30 books on theology and religious and political philosophy. But within 18 months, he published his first book on 9/11, which is called The New Pearl Harbor. New Pearl Harbor. The British version has a U. And to be frank, you probably don't need to go even more than a third of the way in the book to start to understand why it is that Professor David Ray Griffin decided to take early retirement and devote his time to researching the detail of 9/11. As part of his research for the New Pearl Harbor, of course, he read this document, the 9/11 Commission Report. His second book was called The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. And he refers to this document as a 571-page lie. David Ray Griffin would be mortified if anybody labeled him a conspiracy theorist. He is a researcher in deep geopolitics. And he made the observation, I was speaking at an event with him in California last May, and he was very ill because he just recovered from multiple bypass surgery. And he said, Ian, he said, I've realized that everything I did in my academic career was simply preparation for what I'm doing now. He said, this is the real work. He's written 10 books on 9/11 since that time. And he's a Christian. His underlying religious philosophy is based in Christianity. And he realized that most Christians in the US would have a real dichotomy here in understanding that what they believed was a Christian government could ever perpetrate such an event. So he wrote a book called 9/11 and the Christian Faith. And of course what he did was he introduced them to Hitler's observation, which he wrote in Mein Kampf, which said the greater the crime perpetrated by the leadership, the less likelihood it is that the people will ever believe their leaders to be capable of perpetrating such an event. And of course his propaganda minister, Goebbels, said national leaders are grateful for stupid people. And it wasn't particularly an original observation. I mean, Karen Douglas referenced Machiavelli, and Machiavelli said pretty much the same thing in The Prince in 1500 or so. And in fact, Sun Tzu made pretty much the same observation in The Art of War a couple of millennia prior to that. Now, when people are in a profession and then something occurs which really does rock their worldview, it's a real shock. It was a shock to me in 1991. It was a shock to David Ray Griffin in 2003. And let me introduce you to this guy, Danny Javenko. Because Danny Javenko is a Dutch specialist in controlled demolition. And what he's being shown here, he's never seen it before, and he's being shown the film of World Trade Center 7 collapsing at 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11. Now, it's in Dutch, but if you can't see the text at the bottom of the screen, I'll read it out. Fingers crossed that this works. What you see at the World Trade Center, these are pictures of Building 7. Let's take this and look at what we see. Do you see a fire above somewhere? I see smoke. Yeah, you always get dust. Nothing has been removed from the building. Does the top go first? No, the bottom. It starts on the bottom. They simply blew up columns and the rest caved in afterwards. Did this fall like a controlled demolition? Do you see the bottom floors go first? Yes, the rest implodes. This is controlled demolition. You're sure? Absolutely, it's been imploded. This was a hired job. A team of experts did this. But it also happened on September the 11th. The same day? The same day? Are you sure? Yes. I remember that they told they imploded it and it smoked for days. There was already much smoke gone. Are you sure it was the 11th? That can't be. 7 hours after the World Trade Center came down. Then they worked hard. This was Danny Zhivenko's realization as an expert in controlled demolition. In fact, he actually went on, he said, I must know these guys. Controlled demolition is, quite a small profession. This rocked Danny Zhivenko's world. He became an inadvertent 9/11 truther. Not looking at any other issue, but simply explaining that the official version of Building 7 does not stack up. Here's a controlled demolition expert telling you that Building 7 came down by controlled demolition. Of course, the 9/11 Commission report forgets to mention anything about Building 7. Here's another piece of evidence that Danny Zhivenko said was definitely part of controlled demolition. And this is from the World Trade Center towers. Now, it's the World Trade Center towers and the collapse of the towers that cause you to have to suspend your knowledge of Newtonian physics if you believe the official version of events. Building 7 was indeed a perfectly executed controlled demolition. The building came down in its own footprint, and the pile of rubble was 12.5% the original height of the building, exactly as per the controlled demolition textbooks. Buildings 1 and 2, which are more than twice the height of Building 7, just to put it in perspective, Building 7 was roughly the height of the tower at Canary Wharf, just to put it in perspective. But Buildings 1 and 2 collapsed into dust. The buildings totally disintegrated. There is no explanation as to what has caused that. It's a big question that's left open. Take a look at this for a second.
This is an orange. If you were told it was something else, you wouldn't believe it, would you? This is called visual identification based on experience. This building is about to be destroyed in what is called controlled demolition. Buildings do not do this spontaneously. Here is another example of controlled demolition. The initial charges are spaced about 1 second apart. And you can see that each section begins falling separately. Successful demolitions require that all the structural support columns collapse at virtually the same time. If they don't, or if something else goes wrong, the result will look something like this. This is World Trade Center 7 just before it collapsed on September the 11th, 2001. It had not been hit by an aircraft. It had been damaged by falling debris and fire. But by 5:20 p.m., most of the fires had been extinguished. Although the building was 47 stories high, it doesn't fall sideways, nor collapse unevenly. For this to have happened, all of the building's vertical supports must have given way at almost exactly the same time. Yet the Federal Emergency Management Agency reported that the collapse was due primarily to fire. But what does it look like to you? As of July 2007, there is no final report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7, but the National Institute of Standards and Technology still rules out a controlled demolition. So the question is, do you believe what you can see with your own eyes, or do you believe what you are told?
If you Google Danny Zhivenko, then you'll find the full video. And Danny Zhivenko asks for the plans of Building 7 because he says, I don't know the building. And he talks through how they had to have planted the explosives to bring it down in that way. And of course there are other anomalies which really haven't been explained. Of course the classic one is the BBC remarkably predicting that Building 7 was going to fall. This is Jane Stanley actually announcing on BBC television that Building 7 had collapsed when here it is still in the background. And this also happened on CNN as well. So, the BBC, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Jane Stanley was involved in any way, shape or form. Obviously somebody passed the script to Jane Stanley and she got a little bit ahead of herself, like the other reporters on the US stations. Jane Stanley has simply said, well, I just basically said what I was told to say. But here it is, prima facie evidence, standing right behind her. In fact, the live feed cut mysteriously a few minutes later, and then 7 minutes after the live feed was cut, the building fell. And there's other news reports, there's other footage of the police telling people to get out of the area because Building 7 was going to be brought down. Let's get a bit closer to home. A few weeks ago, I found myself in Sheffield. I was giving a talk in Sheffield. And this was Monday, September the 5th, so pretty recent. And on that evening, I met this gentleman. He came along to my talk. This is Tony Farrell. He was a principal intelligence analyst with South Yorkshire Police. Well, a year prior, in June of 2010, Tony Farrell had been requested by his employers, the South Yorkshire Police, to put together a report on the terror threat in South Yorkshire. Now, up until this time, Tony had never questioned the orthodox view of any event. But in the course of doing his research for this particular report, he established, beyond any reasonable doubt in his own mind, that the events of 9/11 and 7/7 were not as per the official version of events. This guy was a principal intelligence analyst. He'd been with the South Yorkshire Police as a criminal analyst for 17 years. And when he presented his report to his bosses, the first thing they said was, Tony, you need to get yourself to occupational health. So 2 days later, Tony was going to be participating in his employment tribunal, his appeal at employment tribunal against his dismissal. And to cut a long story short, I ended up representing him. And I'm just going to read you a very, very short section from the summation that I read to the tribunal panel at the end of the case. In the course of making my final statement to the appeal tribunal, I said nobody, not an analyst, not a manager, not a member of the disciplinary panel, nor the appeal panel, spent any time investigating the evidence that underpins Mr. Farrell's changed view on the strategic threat associated with the terrorism domain. And his changed view was that there was no terror threat in Yorkshire, certainly no Islamic terror threat. The real terror threat was from Number 10 and from Century House. And he incorporated this in his report. He's a criminal analyst. There is no evidence that anyone considered any evidence before concluding that Mr. Farrell's views were outlandish. And in the course of cross-examination of the managers that had terminated his employment, I pushed them. I said, did you actually look at the physical evidence? And to a man, they said no. The guy who actually fired him was the Chief Financial Officer of the South Yorkshire Police Authority. And he actually said, in the process of terminating Tony Farrell, he said, you might be right. You might actually be right, but I'm not going to look at it. But you might be right. But your views are incompatible with your continued employment with South Yorkshire Police. So he was effectively fired for doing his job, for upholding the highest ideals of honesty and integrity, exactly as required by the South Yorkshire Police Employment Guidelines. In the course of cross-examination, I asked the Chief Financial Officer if he could actually consider any possibility where he would be required to submit incomplete accounts. And of course he said absolutely not. And so I said, well, why do you expect Mr. Farrell to submit an incomplete criminal analysis? We've heard We heard Karen Douglas speaking, and she also made some observation about the attraction of conspiracies, certainly in her website. Well, you know, what is it that attracted Tony Farrell at the age of 50 to actually put a report together that questioned the official version of events? Was it the loss of his 17-year career? Was it the loss of his salary? Was it the loss of his index-linked pension? The desire to be labelled insane, which certainly the South Yorkshire Police Authority tried to do, without even looking at the report? Desire to be ostracised by colleagues or to become unemployable? This guy demonstrated the highest levels of integrity, a much higher level of integrity than I believe we've witnessed more recently. So, why did he do it? Well, I don't know, let's ask him ourselves. Tony Farrell's here with us right now. This is Tony Farrell. Tony, maybe you could just take 5 minutes and explain why you did what you did.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for the applause. The reason why I did it is that professional standards for honesty and integrity state that I cannot tell a lie or give misleading information. And on the terror threat, when I'd been persuaded by the lies of 9/11 and 7/7 official narratives, I couldn't, in all honesty, go along with a narrative from the government that said the main threat to the UK citizens is from Islamic terrorism. I myself am a Christian, but the Ninth Commandment compels me not to speak, not to bear false witness against my neighbour. I just want briefly to mention a few profiles of how they treated me. The DCI, my immediate line manager, immediately upon the alert, I have to go to occupational health. He's totally closed minds to the possibility of 9/11 and 7/7 being anything other than the government narratives. The Director of Intelligence, the next one up, he believes, he says, don't rock the boat, Tony. You and I will never get the government to tell the truth. The dismissing officer, Director of Finance, at the dismissal hearing said, your beliefs are generally held and they may even be correct. At the appeal hearing, the internal one, in front of the South Yorkshire Police Appeals Committee, the chair of that meeting says, my views are outlandish. They label me insane immediately on the red alert. The view eventually of the occupational health therapist, he asked me a question, what if you're wrong? I said, I'm entirely open to persuasion, but the serious question is, what if I'm right? My health came back perfectly okay, much to the disappointment of South Yorkshire Police senior managers. The Chief Constable never spoke to me. The senior operational command team never spoke to me. They went at the mantra they went by at this time was a mantra called enabling the one truth. I asked the performance manager in the force, what on earth does enabling the one truth mean? She turned round to me and we were both dismayed. If management say it's the truth, it is the truth. The Judge Rostrand at the first pre-hearing review, he said my views on 9/11 were absurd. And yet, at the same time, contradictory, he says that Tony Farrell, as an intelligent person, had considered all the evidence and decided and concluded that it pointed to one direction as opposed to another. I want to talk about quickly the media, the mainstream media. They haven't touched it, save The Sun, who did a character assassination on me when they called round at my house without being invited and then published some very brief but derogatory remarks about me. The alternative media, by and large, have embraced what I've done, but nevertheless, there's a combination of plaudits and critics. That's okay. The employment judges, the 3 employment judges that Ian was actually helping me out as representing my case for me. Basically, they were confronted with the fact that at no stage had South Yorkshire Police ever given me the opportunity to present the analysis that I was offering them, and were in complete shutdown, and it was institutional denial. Senior command team. All I can say is I think their views, the very fact that operational police officers of senior South Yorkshire Police when they task a principal intelligence analyst to do a threat assessment, and then when he alerts that analyst alerts them to a terrible threat, when they can't speak and hide behind other subordinate officers, when they can't confront me, then we have got another case of institutional denial. It's a case of, don't trouble me with the facts, my mind is already made up. I think that's probably the 5 minutes. Can the police ever do such a thing? Can they lie? Can they cover up? You bet they can. I could tell you a tale today, which I won't, on Hillsborough. Having worked within the police, I know a story that has clearly been covered up for the last 22 years. And if that story was out, then everybody's perception of what happened in 1989 in that stadium would be reversed. So, conspiracy theories? No, it's about weighing up the evidence and deciding in your own mind, and there is a comment up here that you can all read about the truth. It's about standing up to that truth and confronting it. Thank you very much.
The reason that I represented Tony was having met him briefly on the Monday and then speaking with him on the Tuesday night, he let slip that he'd released his legal representation team on the Monday because he'd run out of money. The legal team were going to be charging 500 quid an hour for a case that was going to run through 3 days, which would have effectively taken Tony into bankruptcy. I was a lot cheaper. I paid my own way for that. And I will support anybody who finds themselves in a situation where, in my opinion, if they have been genuine in their research and come to these conclusions through epistemological integrity, then I will do whatever it takes to support them. The day that it becomes received wisdom that the events of 9/11 and or 7/7 were events that occurred in some way other than the official version of events, obviously Tony Farrell's looking at some very significant compensation. But I think we can understand this. I called it institutional denial, but I think there is some very interesting research, and I would encourage the psychologists to look at some of the work of some of their colleagues. This is from Betty Edwards, drawing on the right side of the brain. The left brain is what is dominant in Western society, and the left brain is like a kid. The left brain wants to believe that everything is wonderful, that your government is going to look after you, that your media is always going to tell you the truth, and Santa Claus is going to come along at Christmas and deliver the prezzies. Betty Edwards says the dominant left verbal hemisphere doesn't want too much information about the things it perceives, just enough to recognize and categorize. The left brain, in this sense, learns to take a quick look and says, right, that's a chair, or an umbrella, a tree, a dog, or in the case of the presentations earlier today, a conspiracy theory. Because the brain is overloaded most of the time with incoming information, it seems that one of its functions is to screen out a large proportion of incoming perceptions. David Pedersen, in his chimeral analysis, where he was looking at why it is that basically people will do jobs that are inhuman, like working in concentration camps. And he said it would appear that the left logical hemisphere can be persuaded or manipulated into believing a certain belief or behavior was logically correct. Once this is established in the mind of the individual, then it appears possible to carry out any form of atrocity under the cloak of it being justifiable. Because the left brain actually does exactly what happened in South Yorkshire Police Authority. It says, no, don't even look at the evidence, because if you look at it, it might just change your worldview. So rather than change your worldview, don't even go there, don't look at it. This is institutional denial. And just because it is a mainstream view, just because it's the consensus, doesn't make it true. And this is an absolutely superb book, Left in the Dark by Graham Ginn and Tony Martin. And here they make the observation, they said, the fact that our twin cerebral system is dominated by the least functional side has set up a bizarre problem. The self that is damaged dominates us. And because it is damaged, we don't realize the extent of the problem. It is stuck in its own distorted and limited version of reality and does all it can to maintain this illusion. And it keeps us looking at events as random events. It refuses to allow us to look at the connectivity. What I'm going to do the last few minutes of my time here is I'm going to show the first few minutes of some interviews with clinical psychologists in the US. But these are clinical psychologists that have practiced intellectual and epistemological integrity and actually done their research before making their comments and observations.
At this point, we have 9 years of hard scientific evidence that disproves the government theory about what happened on September 11th, and yet people continue to be either oblivious to the fact that this information exists or completely resistant to looking at this information. So the question becomes why? Why is it that people have so much trouble hearing this information? From my work, I think we would be remiss not to look at the impact of trauma. My name is Marty Hopper, and I'm a PhD clinical psychologist. I've been working and living for the past 30 years here in Boulder, Colorado. For the past 11 years, my work has focused on helping people who have experienced personal trauma. Now, as we know, the horrors of what happened on 9/11 were televised all over the world, and they were televised, in fact, live. We witnessed the deaths of almost 3,000 of our fellow Americans. We know this had a very severe and traumatic impact on a large majority of the population. I myself cried for weeks after September 11th. A friend of mine who is a psychologist in practice here in Boulder said that her caseload increased tremendously after 9/11, and people that she hadn't seen in 10 years were coming back into her practice. So I think it's safe to say that collectively as a nation, because of what happened on September 11th, we experienced trauma.
I'm Fran Schiller, and I have a master's degree from the University of Colorado. I've had private practice as a psychotherapist and as a licensed professional counselor for about 20 years. Why do people resist this information? The information that shows that the official story about 9/11 cannot be true. What I've learned is that as humans, each of us have a worldview, and that worldview is usually formed in great part by the culture we grow up in. When we hear information that contradicts our worldview, social psychologists call the resulting insecurity cognitive dissonance. For example, with 9/11, we have one cognition, which is what the official story and what our government told us, or our media repeated to us over and over, that 19 Muslims attacked us. On the other hand, we have what scientists, researchers, architects, engineers are now beginning to tell us, which is that there is evidence that shows that the official story cannot be true. So now we've lost our sense of security. We are starting to feel vulnerable. Now we're confused.
9/11 truth challenges some of our most fundamental beliefs about our government and about our country. When your beliefs are challenged, or when two beliefs are inconsistent, cognitive dissonance is created. 9/11 truth challenges the beliefs that our country protects us and keeps us safe, and that America is a good guy. My name is Bob Hopper, and I have a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Cincinnati.
Okay, we'll include the full video into the DVD version of this presentation and the one that will go out on Channel 200. What I hope I've demonstrated here is that there is perhaps information that hasn't been looked at. It is wrong to label everybody who has an alternative view to the orthodox line of events as a conspiracy theorist. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I abhor conspiracy theory as much as everybody else. I'm a researcher in deep geopolitics, as is David Ray Griffin, and as now is Tony Farrell, and as was Danny Javenko. Danny Javenko had a car accident a few weeks ago. No other vehicle was involved, but he crashed into a tree and died. At times of great trauma, speaking the truth takes great courage. And that's why I applaud the decision of Tony Farrell not to succumb to the request by his bosses to submit a sanitized report, but to uphold the highest ideals of integrity and give up a career that he loved, give up his livelihood and his income and his pension, all in the name of truth. All we ask is that instead of standing on a platform and labeling people en masse, let's see some intellectual curiosity and some epistemological honesty. Thank you very much.